Organizations are never completely static. They are in continuous interaction with external forces. Changing consumer lifestyles and technological breakthroughs all act on the organization to cause it to change. The degree of change may vary from one organization to another, but all face the need for adaptation to external forces. Because change is occurring so rapidly, there is a need for new ways to manage it. This is the reason why we need to understand the processes of organization development. For this presentation, the subjects to be tackled include number 1, rationale for organizational development, 2, the organizational development process, 3, the first phase of organization development process, which is entering and contracting, and number 4, the second phase of organization development process, which is diagnosing organizations. Have you tried playing Jenga? Jenga is played with 54 wooden blocks, and these blocks actually come in different sizes and dimensions so as to create imperfections in the stacking process and make the game more challenging. Now, the rule is, once the tower is built, the person who built the tower gets the first move. The game ends when the tower falls or any piece falls from the tower, and the winner is the last person to remove and place a block successfully. Now, in relation to our topic, we live in a world that has been turned upside down. Companies are pouring money, technology, and management expertise into regions that were once off limits. And with the unanticipated global pandemic, companies have to thrive. Now, the question is, why do we need to understand the concept of organizational development process? With the unanticipated attack of the coronavirus virus, change is avalanching down upon our heads, and most people are utterly unprepared to cope with it. As such, tomorrow's world will be different from today's, calling for new organizational approaches, as organizations will need to adapt to these changes and at the same time cope with the need for renewing a rather reactive workforce. Every day, managers are confronted with massive and accelerating change, and preparing managers to cope with today's accelerating role of change is imperative, as modern managers need to exhibit flexibility and the ability to adapt in a changing environment. Most importantly, they must be able to diagnose problems and implement change programs in their respective organizations. Before we deal with the process, we define what organization development is, and there are two outstanding definitions provided by Richard Backhard and Warren Bennis, respectively. Richard Backhard said, organization development is an effort that is planned organization-wide and managed from the top to increase organization effectiveness through planned intervention in the organization's processes using behavioral science knowledge. And this means to say that organizational development is deliberately carried out, and it is expected to affect the entire organization. Now, another equally significant concept related to organizational development is the one given by Warren Bennis, and he said, organization development is a response to change, a complex educational strategy intended to change beliefs, attitudes, values, and structures of organizations so that they can better adapt to new technologies, markets, and challenges, and the dizzying rate of change itself. Now, notice that Bennis used four words that are seen today as key components of organizational culture, namely beliefs, attitudes, values, and structure. The definition given by Bennis was later expanded by Edgar Schein, who developed the idea of a cultural iceberg. And if you take a look at this diagram, this illustrates that change in an organization can occur at many levels, as behaviors and their associated artifacts are readily visible to others. Organizational development can effect change in these relatively easily. However, when organizational change needs to penetrate the underlying beliefs, values, and ultimately the unconscious assumptions made in the organization, change is much more difficult. As illustrated in this metaphor of the iceberg, Schein indicated how difficult it is to see the assumptions that underlie our behaviors. In relation to various organizations established whether in public or private sector, the only constant is change, and this is true in technological, social, and economic environment. The pace of change has become so rapid that it is difficult to adjust to or compensate for one change before another is necessary. Change is in essence a moving target. The technological, social, and economic environment is rapidly changing, and an organization will be able to survive only if it can effectively respond to these changing demands. The process of organization development. The planned change process generally starts when one or more key managers or administrators somehow sense that their organization, department, or group could be improved or has problems that could be alleviated through organization development. Now, the first phase of OD process is entering and contracting. Entering and contracting involves defining in a preliminary manner the organization's problems or opportunities for development and establishing a collaborative relationship between the OD practitioner and members of the client system about how to work on those issues. This phase sets the initial parameters for carrying out the subsequent phases of OD, such as diagnosing the organization, planning and implementing changes, and evaluating and institutionalizing them. Now, developing contract typically establishes the expectations of the parties, the time and resources that will be expended, and the ground rules under which the parties will operate, which can be relatively informal and involve only a formal agreement between the client and the OD practitioner. The OD process. OD processes can vary in terms of complexity and formality depending on the situation. Now, there are two situations that we need to examine. Situation A is happening inside the organization, and they are trying to employ organizational development process amongst themselves, whereas for situation B, they are employing an outside or an internal OD practitioner to help them effect organizational process. Now, in situation A, the manager acts as OD practitioner in his or her own organization. Entering and contracting typically involves the manager and the group members in a group meeting to discuss what issues to work on and how they will jointly accomplish that. In situation B, the manager and administrators are considering the use of professional OD practitioners, either from inside or outside of the organization. They may need to meet with representatives of the client organization rather than to meet with the total membership. They may also need to formalize their respective roles and how the change process will unfold. Entering into an OD relationship. Determining whether the two parties should enter into an OD relationship typically involves clarifying the nature of the organization's current functioning and the issues to be addressed, the relevant client system for that issue, and the appropriateness of the particular OD practitioner. In helping assess these issues, the OD practitioner may need to collect preliminary data about the organization. Similarly, the organization may need to gather information about the practitioner's competence and experience. This knowledge will help both parties determine whether they should proceed to develop a contract for working together. Let's go into the details of entering into an OD relationship. The first one is clarifying the organizational issue. When seeking help from OD practitioners, organizations typically start with presenting the problem or the issue that has caused them to consider an OD process. The presenting problem often has an implied or stated solution. For example, managers may believe that because members of their teams are in conflict, team building is the obvious answer. They may even state the presenting problem in the form of a solution, like we need some team building. In many cases, however, the presenting problem is only a symptom of an underlying problem. For example, conflict among members of a team may result from several deeper causes, including ineffective reward systems, personality differences, inappropriate structure, and poor leadership. Now, the second component is determining the OD team members. Generally, such organization members who must be involved are those who can directly impact the change issue, whether it is solving a particular problem or improving an already successful organization or department. In determining the team members, it may be necessary to include members from multiple units, from different hierarchical levels, and even from outside of the organization. Now, the last activity involved in entering an OD relationship is selecting an OD practitioner who has the expertise and experience to work with members on the organizational issue. Right? So in relation to this, the OD professional needs not only a repertoire of technical skills, but also the personality and interpersonal competence to use himself or herself as an instrument of change. However, in selecting an OD practitioner, perhaps the most important issue is the fundamental question: how effective has the person been in the past? With what kinds of organizations? Using what kinds of techniques? In other words, references must be checked. Interpersonal relationships are tremendously important, but even con artists actually have excellent interpersonal relationships and skills. Qualifications of an OD practitioner. Gordon Lippett, a pioneering practitioner in the field, suggested areas that managers should consider before selecting an OD practitioner. Number 1, the ability of the consultant to form interpersonal relationships. Number 2, the degree of focus on the problem, the skills of the practitioner relative to the problem. Number 3, the extent that the consultant clearly informs the client as to his or her role and contribution. Number 4, whether the practitioner belongs to a professional association. References from other clients are highly important. The contracting step in organizational development generally addresses 3 key areas. Number 1, mutual expectations, or what each party expects to gain from the OD process. Number 2, time and resources that will be devoted to it. And number 3, the ground rules for working together. Now, in mutual expectations, normally the client states the services and outcomes to be provided by the OD practitioner and describes what the organization expects from the process and the consultant. On the other hand, the OD practitioner also should state what he or she expects to gain from the OD process. This can include opportunities to try new interventions, report the results to other potential clients, and receive appropriate compensation or recognition. Now, the second component, which is time and resources. In order to accomplish change, the organization and the OD practitioner must commit time and resources to the effort, and each must be clear about how much energy and how much resources will be dedicated to the change process. Failure to make explicit the necessary requirements of a change process can quickly ruin an OD effort. Now, the third one is the ground rules. This pertains to the parameters established, and this may include such issues as confidentiality, if and how the OD practitioner will become involved in personal or interpersonal issues, how to terminate the relationship, and whether the practitioner is supposed to make expert recommendations or help the manager make decisions. Now, for internal consultants, organizational politics make it especially important to clarify issues of how to handle sensitive information and how to deliver bad news. Diagnosing organizations is the second major phase in the general model of plant change. Diagnosis is the process of understanding a system's current functioning. It involves collecting pertinent information about current operations, analyzing those data, and drawing conclusions for potential change and improvement. Effective diagnosis provides the systematic knowledge of the organization needed to design appropriate interventions. Now, in organization development, diagnosis is a collaborative process between organization members and the OD consultant to collect pertinent information, analyze it, and draw conclusions for action planning and intervention. It may also be aimed at uncovering the causes of specific problems, focus on understanding effective processes, or be directed at assessing the overall functioning of the organization or department to discover areas for future development. Here, diagnosis is development oriented. Organizational diagnosis is a major practitioner skill. It usually examines two broad areas. The first area comprises the various interacting sub-elements that make up the organization. These include the divisions, departments, products, and the relationships between them. The diagnosis may also include a comparison of the top, middle, and lower levels of management in the organization. The second area of diagnosis concerns the organizational processes. These include communication networks, team problem solving, decision making, leadership and authority styles, goal setting and planning methods, and the management of conflict and competition. Please take a look at this diagram. This is a summary of the process undertaken in diagnosing an organization. Diagnosis is a cyclical process that involves data gathering, interpretations, and identification of problem areas and possible action programs. The first step is the preliminary identification of possible problem areas. These preliminary attempts often bring out symptoms as well as possible problem areas. The second step involves gathering data based on the preliminary problem identified in the preceding step. These data are categorized, analyzed, and presented to the client in a feedback session. Look at steps 3 and 4. Now, if it is determined that enough data are available in step 5, the client and practitioner jointly diagnose and identify likely problem areas. This is step 6. Now, at this point, the client's level of motivation to work on the problem is determined in step 7. Based on the diagnosis, the target systems are identified and the change strategy is designed, as you can see in step 8. And finally, for step 9, the results are monitored to determine the degree of change that has been attained versus the desired change goals. The performance gap. Meanwhile, one method in the diagnostic process is to determine the performance gap. Performance gap is the difference between what the organizations could do by virtue of its opportunity in its environment and what it actually does. This leads to an approach that may be termed gap analysis. Now, the gap may be the result of ineffective performance by internal units or may emerge because of competitive changes or new innovations. A performance gap may also occur when the organization fails to adapt to changes in its external environment. Competent organizational diagnosis does not simply provide information about the system. It is also helpful in designing and introducing action alternatives for correcting possible problems. The diagnosis affirms the need for change and the benefits of possible changes in the client system. Now, take note that important problems are very often hidden or obscure, whereas the more conspicuous and obvious problems are relatively unimportant. In such situations, dealing with the obvious may not be a very effective way to manage change. This underscores the importance of the diagnostic stage. The need for diagnostic models. Entry and contracting processes can result in a need to understand a whole system or some part, process, or feature of the organization. Conceptual frameworks that people use to understand organizations are referred to as diagnostic models. Diagnostic models describe the relationships among different features of the organization, its context, and its effectiveness. As a result, diagnostic models point out what areas to examine and what questions to ask in assessing how an organization is functioning. Open Systems Model. The organization serves to coordinate behaviors of its departments so that they function together in service of a goal or strategy. The general diagnostic model based on systems theory that underlies most of organization development is called the Open Systems Model. Systems can vary in how open they are to their outside environments. Open systems such as organizations and people exchange information and resources with their environments. They cannot completely control their own behavior and are influenced in part by external forces. Organizations, for example, are affected by such environmental conditions as the availability of raw material, customer demands, and government regulations. Understanding how these external forces affect the organization can help explain some of its internal behavior. Now, the following three properties of open systems are inputs, transformation, outputs, boundaries, feedback, equifinality, and alignment. Open Systems Model. In relation to the diagram shown in the previous slide, any organizational system is composed of three related parts, namely inputs, transformations, and outputs. Inputs consist of human or other resources such as information, energy, and materials coming into the system. Inputs are acquired from the system's external environment. For example, a manufacturer in an organization acquires raw materials from an outside supplier. Transformations, on the other hand, are the processes of converting inputs into outputs. In organizations, a production or operations function is composed of both social and technological components that generally carries out transformations. The social component consists of people and their work relationships, whereas the technological component involves tools, techniques, and methods of production or service delivery. Outputs are the results of what is transformed by the system and sent to the environment. Thus, inputs that have been transformed represent outputs ready to leave the system. Another key property of the open systems in organizations is boundaries. Boundaries pertain to the idea of helping to distinguish between systems and environments. Closed systems have relatively rigid and impenetrable boundaries, whereas open systems have far more permeable borders. Boundaries pertain to the borders or limits of the system, and these are easily seen in many biological and mechanical systems. For instance, biologically, a person wants to join a beauty contest, but her limitation is that she does not meet the requirement for height qualifications. Another illustration of boundaries in mechanical system is if you want your videos used in vlogging to appear more professional, but your mobile phone has limited features in terms of enhancing the quality of videos taken, as well as inadequate memory to store all the recorded episodes. Now, on the other hand, defining the boundaries of social systems is more difficult because there is a continuous inflow and outflow through them. Let's say, for instance, there are overlaps in the job description of some workers or confusions as to which department or unit should handle a particular concern. Another component is feedback. Feedback pertains to information regarding the actual performance or the results of the system. But not all such information is feedback, however. Only information used to control the future functioning of the system is considered feedback. Next one is equifinality. As one of the key properties in open systems, the idea of equifinality suggests that similar results may be achieved with different initial conditions and in many different ways. This concept suggests that a manager can use varying degrees of inputs into the organization and can transform them in a variety of ways to obtain satisfactory outputs. Thus, the function of management is not to seek a single rigid solution, but rather to develop a variety of satisfactory options. The fifth element or component in the open systems is alignment. Alignment refers to a characteristic of the relationship between two or more parts. It represents the extent to which the features, operations, and characteristics of one system support the effectiveness of another system. When viewed as open system, organization can be diagnosed at 3 levels. The highest level is the overall organization and includes the design of the company's strategy, structure, and processes. Diagnosis can occur at all 3 organizational levels, or it may be limited to issues occurring at a particular level. The key to effective diagnosis is to know what to look for at each level, as well as how the levels affect each other. Now, there are 2 key inputs that affect the way an organization design its strategic orientation. We have the general environment and industry structure. The general environment represents the external elements and forces that can affect the attainment of organization objectives. It can be described in terms of the amount of uncertainty present in social, technological, economic, ecological, and political forces. The more uncertainty there is in how the environment will affect the organization, the more difficult it is to design an effective strategic orientation. The second input is industry structure or task environment. An organization's industry structure or task environment is another important input into strategic orientation. As defined by Michael Porter, an organization's task environment consists of 5 forces: supplier power, buyer power, threats of substitutes, threats of entry, and rivalry among competitors. Look at the diagram in the PowerPoint presentation. This is an illustration of the organization level diagnosis in terms of the design components. The design components pertain to a strategic orientation composed of 5 major design components, namely strategy, technology, structure, measurement systems, and human resources system. And there is an intermediate output, which is culture. Now, effective organizations align their design components to each other and to the environment. A strategy represents the way an organization uses its resources, such as human, economic, or technical in order to gain and sustain a competitive advantage. It can be described by the organization's mission statement, goals and objectives, strategic intent, and functional policies. Now, a mission statement describes the long-term purpose of the organization, the range of products or services offered, the markets to be served, and the social needs served by the organization's existence. For example, for Walt Disney, example would be the mission statement would be to make people happy. For Walmart, to give ordinary folk the chance to buy the same thing as rich people. For Mary Kay Cosmetics, to give unlimited opportunity to women. On the other hand, goals and objectives are statements that provide explicit direction, set organization priorities, provide guidelines for management decisions, and serve as the cornerstone for organizing activities, designing jobs, and setting standards of achievement. Strategic intent is a succinct label that describes how the organization intends to achieve its goals and objectives. For example, an organization can achieve goals through differentiation of its product or service by achieving the lowest costs in the industry or by growth. And finally, functional policies are the methods, procedures, rules, or administrative practices that guide decision-making and convert plans into actions. How an organization divides work. Two ways of determining how an organization divides work are to examine its formal structure or to examine its level of differentiation and integration. Formal structures divide work by function, such as accounting, sales, or production. By product or service, for example, in the case of Chevrolet, Buick, or Pontiac. I don't know if I pronounced that right. Or by some combination of both, a matrix composed of functional departments and product groupings. Now, the second way to describe how work is divided is to specify the amount of differentiation and integration there is in a structure. Applied to the total organization, differentiation refers to the degree of similarity or difference in the design of two or more subunits or departments. In a highly differentiated organization, there are major differences in design among the departments. Some departments are highly formalized with many rules and regulations. Others have fewer rules and regulations, and still others are moderately formal or flexible. The way an organization coordinates the work across subunits is called integration. Integration can be achieved in a variety of ways. For example, by using plans and schedules, using budgets, assigning special roles such as project managers, liaison positions, or integrators, and creating cross-departmental task forces and teams. Now, in diagnosing organizations, the amount of integration required in a structure is a function of, first, the amount of uncertainty in the environment. Second, the level of differentiation in the structure. And third, the amount of interdependence among departments. As uncertainty, differentiation, and interdependence increase, more sophisticated integration devices are required. All of this will be tackled in a more in-depth manner in the discussion of diagnosing groups and jobs later on. In conclusion, The degree of change may vary from one organization to another, but all face the need for adaptation to external forces. Many of these changes are forced upon the organization, whereas others are generated internally. Because change is occurring so rapidly, there is a need for new ways to manage it. The successful 21st century manager must deal with a chaotic world of new competitors and constant innovation. In the future, the only winning companies will be the ones that respond quickly to change. And the source of my research is Cummings and Worley, 2008, Organization and Development and Change, 9th edition by Cengage Learning. It is an ebook or a PDF file. Thank you so much for listening.